My name is Debbie Leuchter Stueber, and I grew up on Long Island. I live in Pittsburgh, and I've been a volunteer at the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh for 25 to 30 years, and I'm part of their Generations group as well as their Generations Speaker Series. My mom, Edith Loeb, that was her maiden name. She was born in Bruchsal, Germany, near Heidelberg, and my father was born in Vienna, Austria. My mom was born on December 31st, 1927, and she and her family lived in an apartment above the grocery store that her father owned, where he sold butcher supplies and tools and produce. Life was pretty good. She had relationships with non-Jews. On Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938, the night of broken glass, she was looking out her window and saw flames and heard breaking glass and was very frightened and went to her mother's room with her brother to seek comfort. My family went to Bruchsal, Germany in 2017 and in 2022. In 2022, we were standing outside my mother's home, and for the first time I realized my mother just didn't see flames and hear sirens. She was looking at her own synagogue being burned. That was obviously quite emotional for us. Prior to Kristallnacht, her father, Max Loeb, emigrated to the United States. Her mom thought it was worse for men and the women and children would be just fine. So he emigrated in July of 1938, hoping to send for the rest of the family because he could see that the future was going to be bleak. On October 22nd, 1940, was when about 6,500 Jews were deported from southwestern Germany, including Bruchsal. It was early in the morning and there was a knock at the door, and the Nazis gave my mother and her grandmother 1 hour to gather a few possessions and turned over the key to their home and were marched to the railroad station. My mother's brother, prior to that, in I think 39, he was sent away to a school in Frankfurt and then an orphanage, and then he was deported to Theresienstadt, and then he was deported to Auschwitz where he was murdered. We are really fortunate in that we have many letters and drawings by my Uncle Heinz that have been translated for us. There's footage of the day of deportation. And in February 2020, we discovered that my mother, her mother, and her grandmother are in the footage. It was hidden in the Bruchsal archives, and when we went to Bruchsal in 2022, we met the man who was responsible for having the footage made public, and he threatened the local government he would sue them if they didn't make this public. And there's actually a website with that footage, another footage having to do with the Nazis coming into Bruchsal, and they were able to identify most of the people in the footage. My mother actually identified the rabbi of the town before she saw herself. The local theater got wind of the footage, and long story short, they connected to a playwright, and the playwright and the director interviewed my mom, my dad, my sister, and I, and also did a lot of research with the Erlson archives and wrote a play called The Girl with the Hat Box, because my mother is carrying around a suitcase that kind of looks like a hat box. On October 22nd, 1940, my mom and her mother and grandmother were deported to Gers in southwestern France, an internment camp, which I always like to point out when I make my presentations that internment camps are completely different than death or concentration camps. But they still treated everybody badly, and plenty of people died from starvation or disease. And at one point, they were deported to another camp called Rivesaltes in the area of Perpignan in the south of France. And my grandmother had the opportunity, along with other parents in the camp, to sign over their children to an organization called OSE, Organisation pour sauver des enfants, which means Organization to Save the Children, translated from French. It was a Jewish underground organization that actually started, I believe, in Russia in the 20s or the 30s. But this was a Jewish underground organization during the war that saved over 5,000 Jewish children. Shortly after my grandmother turned my mother over to this organization, my grandmother was deported to Drancy, another internment camp in France, and from there she was deported to Auschwitz. But when they were in Rivesaltes, the second internment camp, my grandmother had a hernia and she was ill. So we actually don't know if our grandmother died in the cattle car on the way there or if she was murdered in the gas chambers. We'll just never know. My mother was in 5 different orphanages and schools throughout France. She was in one orphanage called Majelier for about 1.5 years, and there she met a young boy named Kurt, and he really liked her, but she didn't like him because she thought he was pretty arrogant. She was also at some point given a false identity. Her false papers indicated she was from Alsace-Lorraine, the geographic area between France and Germany. And her papers indicated she was from this particular town, that she was also at some point a nanny for a family from that town. So she had to know the town back and forth, the main square where the church was, because if she didn't, these people might have discovered and reported her to the Nazis. And at the end of the war, she became a French Girl Scout. In April of 1946, she was able to get an affidavit from her father, Max, who was already here. And she landed in America on a freighter called a Fort Royale on April 1946. My father's name is Kurt Leuchter, and he was born in Vienna, Austria on February 6, 1929. He was an only child. His parents' names were Moritz and Rosa Leuchter. My mother's parents' names were Max and Julia Loeb. My grandfather owned a wholesale silk business, and they were comfortable, and everything in their life was pretty good until March 12, 1938, the day of the Anschluss, when Germany invaded Austria. On November 10, 1938, because Kristallnacht lasted from the 9th to the 10th, it was in the morning, and my father was sent home early from school, and on his way home from school, he saw a synagogue burning, not his own, like my mother, and he watched the Nazis dragging the men out of the synagogue and throwing the Torahs, our sacred scrolls, into the Danube River, and he hurried home. But when he got there, he saw that the Nazis were arresting his father along with 9 other Jewish men. And he was 8 years old. So he sat on steps crying because his mother was out shopping. Shortly thereafter, she arrived home. My father told her what happened, and she said it was no longer safe to stay. So they moved to my father's grandmother's house. 10 days later, there was a knock at the door, and they were afraid to open it, thinking it was the Gestapo, but they opened the door, and there's a disheveled man standing there. They weren't sure who he was. It ended up being my father's father. And he shared that they held him in an armory and they mistreated him. And they threatened to cut off his ring finger if he couldn't remove his wedding ring and give it to them. But fortunately, he was finally able to do so. And the Nazis gave him 3 months to get his family out of Austria. My grandfather was able to procure a visa through Genoa, Italy, and they left Austria and ended up in Antwerp, Belgium, for I think a year and a half. Things were quiet. Then the Germans invaded Belgium. All the Jewish men were deported to the south of France. My grandfather was in 3 different camps, Saint-Cyprien, Gers, and the last camp he was in was Camp des Milles. So my father and his mother got on a train to go to Marseille in France, but they accidentally got off a stop before, which was extremely dangerous as they had no ID papers. So my father, at 11 years old, somehow knew they were in peril and had to act quickly. So he hurried his mother through the train station, and they registered with the Jewish agency, and they were put in another internment camp. But they were able to visit my grandfather in Camp des Milles on the weekends, and my father would bring food to him. My father, he was also in a boys' delinquent home in a town called Gilles-les-Bois. And the director of the home, Mademoiselle Burel, she knew the mayor of that town, and the mayor of that town was able to provide false papers to my father, and his new name was now Claude Lambert. He was the only Jewish boy hiding in this boys' delinquent home, and somebody squealed. So my father was hiding in a closet for several hours, and luckily the Nazis didn't open it, but Mademoiselle Burel, the director, knew it was no longer safe for my father to stay, so she connected him to the Maquis, the French underground. And for the remainder of the war, for about a year, he fought in the French underground, blowing up German convoys and the railroad tracks. And then after the war, he was in 2 more orphanages, one in Lyon and one in Paris. And in Paris, he attended a technical school and also learned how to make leather handbags. He had an aunt and uncle here who provided him with a visa. And he got here in September of 1946 on the French troop ship called the Athos II, with 70 other orphans, and since he was older than them, he took care of them on the journey. In January 1947, my father was outside the Museum of Modern Art in Manhattan, and he was chatting with his friends, and Edith, the girl he liked in Montpellier, tapped him on the shoulder. And they embraced and they started talking, and my father immediately took her phone number, and then they started dating, and they were married on August 13th, 1950, which coincidentally is my oldest son's birthday. He was born in their 40th anniversary. In 1951, he was drafted into the US Army and went to Korea and was on the 38th parallel for 9 months, and luckily he made it home safe. He worked for Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, and worked on TVs, and eventually, without a high school or college degree, worked for a company called Grumman Aerospace, and he worked on several Apollo missions, and his name with several other 100 engineers is on microfiche on the moon. In 2011, my father was awarded the Legion of Honor Award from the government of France, and I read the letter and something didn't make sense to me. I know my father's a Holocaust survivor. I know he fought in the French underground. I know he went to Korea, and I know his name's on the moon. But for the first time I realized since he fought in the French underground, he's also a World War II vet. So in 2017, we went to my mother's hometown, and we had 5 Stolpersteine installed. Stolperstein means stumbling stone. A non-Jewish German named Günter Denmig started this project in Berlin, I believe, in 2000. So the stumbling stones are placed in front of the home the person last lived before being deported. and it has their name when they were born and what happened to them, whether they were murdered or whether they survived. So we have 5 Stolperstein for my mother, her brother, her parents, and her grandmother. So hard to explain how incredible these people were in Bruchsal. They were open and generous of heart, and some spent the day with my family during the ceremony. So there was a ceremony for 5 different families that day, including mine. One of the families was from Bruchsal, and they did not know that their great uncle, who was disabled, was murdered by the Nazis. At this point, there is over 100,000 Stolperstein in over 25 countries, and it's considered the largest deconstructed Holocaust memorial in the world. I grew up on Long Island, but not in an area where there were a lot of Jews, and I was exposed to anti-Semitism in first grade when my classmate called me a dirty Jew. And then there were other incidents throughout my life. I do like to say, though, that after Tree of Life, when I thought about, it was a very difficult time for all of us in Pittsburgh, but I also think about the fact that when I walk out my door, I'm not showing my vulnerability. I just look like an average white person. So I can't even imagine what people of color go through when they walk out their door. Big difference. But I still was affected by anti-Semitism my whole life. My parents were extremely overprotective, understandably so. I wasn't really allowed to do that much. One person says that my father thought there was a Nazi around every corner. And ever since we were young, my father said, you always need to have your passports ready to go to Israel because the Holocaust could happen again. And my sister would respond, Dad, this is the United States. That would never happen here. After Tree of Life happened, I actually went and spoke to a therapist. I didn't know anybody personally. Of course, Pittsburgh, there's 1 degree of separation, but I was definitely affected differently as a child of survivors. My mother's last name is Loeb, which means strong man or lion. And my father's last name is Leuchter, which means candelabra. I'd like to think the strength and branches of my family now give us all light and hope for the future.